Good evening. Welcome to Fletcher Hall, to the home of the Rollins College of Business here at UTC. My name is Catherine Middleton. I am faculty in the Economics Department, and I also serve on the Chamber of Commerce International Business Council. That mission is to be a resource and an advocate for international businesses in Chattanooga and local businesses who do business internationally. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Dooley, who is the Dean of the Rollins College of Business.
All right, I think it's working. All right, good evening. Good to see everyone, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Rollins College of Business. We are a bit cozy in here, so I'm going to take the opportunity to say that's a good problem and do a shameless plug for the new building that's being built adjacent to the Rollins College of Business. So if you saw the construction, that's the new 98,000 square foot expansion for the Rollins College. And we look forward to hosting all of you in December of 2027 to celebrate the grand opening. And then we'll have a proper place to host these events in the new Rollins College. So take that opportunity. I want to thank Dr. Williamson, Kramer, the Probasco Chair of Free Enterprise, and the Chattanooga Chamber of International Business Council for hosting this program. And, you know, we're pleased to host these types of events in the college and bring together business leaders, policymakers, scholars. We've got students in the room to examine issues that are shaping our regional and global economy. And probably nothing more timely than to talk about tariffs as it's getting ready to be brought before the Supreme Court and what's going to happen with tariffs. But they're a powerful trade lever, that disrupts supply chains, investment decisions, job creation, industry competitiveness, not only at the local but the national and the global level. In Chattanooga, with its global connections through our supply chains, advanced manufacturing hubs, and entrepreneurship is not immune to this. In fact, I was talking to Craig earlier, listening to some of the disruption in logistics, and it's quite striking what that disruption portends for us in the future. But we're fortunate tonight to have this distinguished group of panelists who will help us unpack what tariffs mean for the regional economy and for industries in this region, and understanding the challenges and perhaps some opportunities that might come as well from understanding better tariffs. So again, thank you to the Probasco Chair, to the International Business Council, the Chattanooga Chamber, and to our panelists for being here with us this evening. We look forward to an invigorating discussion. And with that, I'll hand it back to Catherine.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Dean Dooley. All right, so before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsor this evening, which is the law firm of Miller & Martin. We'd also like to thank Apple Spice, our caterers, for our refreshments this evening. And then additionally, many thanks to our Phillips Scholars, which is a scholarship program in the Probasco Chair of Free Enterprise. They've been a great help this evening with some of our logistics and getting prepared for this evening. So we want to give a thank you to them. I would like to also point out, we will have a Q&A portion a little bit later in the program. So we'll have the moderated panel, and then we'll have Q&A from the audience. But so that we can avoid any duplicate questions and also avoid trying to pass a microphone around this crowded classroom. It's never as graceful as you would like that to be. So we are going to use a QR system. So I have a QR code. If you will notice in your packet, there is a panel, there's a flyer for tonight's event. There's a big QR code on it. You can also use the one here on the main screen. Use your phone, and you can ask your questions, type in your questions at any time during tonight's panel. All right, so you can type in your questions there. Those will come to me in real time. I have my computer down here so that I can choose our more popular questions, the questions we're seeing quite often, and I can address those to the panel a little bit later. All right, so if you would, the QR code is on that flyer, but it's also up there. All right, so now I would like to introduce tonight's moderator. Adam Myers is the VP of Economic Development for the Chattanooga Chamber. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Can you all hear me all right? Make sure the mic still works. And trying not to get disruption here. So, Catherine mentioned, my name is Adam Myers. I'm the Vice President of Economic Development for the Chattanooga Area Chamber. And I think my title is what gave me the distinction of drawing the short straw at the chamber and saying I get to moderate the tariff discussion. So, as the panel is titled, we are here today to talk about how we are navigating tariffs in the economy and really how that's having an impact on our local community. So we have an amazing, incredible panel of experts here that we want you all to be able to hear from. We have some questions prepared, but as Catherine mentioned, please make sure to submit your questions using the QR code because we want to get to a Q&A portion with everyone as well. So with us today, we have the CEO and founder of FreightWaves, Craig Fuller. We are honored to have the mayor of the city of Chattanooga, Tim Kelly, with us. And we also have the professor of economics, Probasco Distinguished Chair of Free Enterprise here at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Dr. Claudia Kramer, and a partner with Womble Dickinson, John Scannapieco. Hopefully I pronounced that all right.
That's pretty good.
Who really specializes in consulting with clients on all things that go cross borders for them. So we have some amazing panelists here, but where we really wanted to start today is actually with you, Claudia, if you can, to kind of demystify tariffs for us. You know, kind of give us an explanation. What are they? How do they impact businesses? And I almost want to say, how did we get here? But I don't know if anyone can really answer that question.
That would be the billion-dollar question to answer. But I'm going to start with the easier one, at least for an econ professor, because about week 2 in any principles class, we start talking about the benefits of trade. We say it's voluntary exchange, it is a positive-sum game, it's mutual cooperation, otherwise why would you do it? It's voluntary. And so if you're selling something that I think is going to benefit me, and it's at a price in which is less than what I think that would cost me, then we exchange. And so that doesn't change whether or not we're talking about exchanging or trading with your neighbor, or trading with somebody across the state line in Georgia, or trading with somebody in the country of Georgia. So the logic is exactly the same. So oftentimes though, when I think the public hears tariff, they don't realize that we're just talking about taxes. So tariff is a tax on an imported good. And so when you start thinking about it in that perspective, you usually have a negative gut reaction when you think that your goods that you want to purchase are being taxed more. And that's exactly what's happening. And so oftentimes, again, the public narrative instead is, oh, we're going to make the foreign producer of a good or service pay this, when in fact it's the domestic, in our case, it's us, the U.S. consumers, are the ones that are going to be paying this tax. We call this the pass-through rate. And so it is estimated that any tariff is 80 to 100% being passed on to the domestic, or for us, the U.S. consumer. The consumer, so that's not even on the producer side. And so it is exactly backwards when it's being pitched that a tariff is going to raise revenue for the U.S. government and it's being paid by the foreign company. It is being paid for by the U.S. consumer. And just to give an example of some of these numbers from the 2018 tariffs, it is estimated that the 2018, so Trump's first term, tariffs raised about $80 billion in government revenue, but at a $100 billion cost to us in the sense of inefficiency. And so on one hand, we think about, okay, it's going to tax the U.S. consumer more. Well, part of the issue with that is that we start making different decisions. So consumers start altering their behavior, right? So maybe you were going to buy a car and now you're holding off and you'll do something else with that money. But you're worse off because your first choice was to buy a vehicle, but now it's $3,000 more because of the newly implemented tariffs. Whereas the businesses are also going to make different decisions that were not necessarily their first choice. That's what in econ we call an inefficiency or a deadweight loss. And so that just gives you some of the perspective in terms of how in economics, and again, 2 weeks in, your second week in a principles class, we're hitting you with this. So it's to us the foundational argument of understanding supply and demand and understanding voluntary exchange. And that logic holds whether or not we're talking about, again, with your neighbor or somebody in another country.
Well, thank you for giving us that perspective. I think, that is certain, one of the things we are hearing is just not only on the consumer side, but also the business side, the amount of uncertainty that it's causing and how that's impacting decisions and affecting really conversations that are having. So with that, I'd love to go to Mayor Kelly for our next question, to kind of talk about, from Chattanooga's local government perspective, how have these recent U.S. tariff policies, such as those on steel, aluminum, Chinese imports, affected some of our key industries here in Chattanooga, like manufacturing and our automotive supply chain in the region?
Well, I might ask you that. But no, but from where I mean, honestly, I've talked to a lot of people in their office, including your boss and people up and down the line, and I guess to sum it up, it's had a very chilling effect. Right? Again, the tariffs in and of themselves are, I think, are a drag on the economy, but to make matters worse, if they were predictable and fixed, it would be one thing. Right? I think nobody seems to know from one day to the next what's going to happen, and markets hate unpredictability. So there's just a real chill right now. I mean, it feels like the car is, as I think one of the Fed governors said, pulled over on the side of the road with the blinkers on.
I think that's a really good way to put it, and from many of our conversations, that's exactly kind of what we've seen from a local economic development standpoint, is a lot of companies saying, hey, we can't really plan right now. We're waiting to get some kind of certainty that will help us, whether we have a tariff or not have a tariff. It's that uncertainty right now, the going back and forth, that's really causing a lot of the disruption from a business standpoint. So Craig, I'd love to ask the next question of you. You're tracking supply chain disruptions globally. How have escalating tariffs really altered freight volumes, not only just the volumes, but also the costs, and also the decisions for shippers?
So, are we still on or not?
There we are. We're not on mute anymore. Ultimately, so we see high frequency transactions. We see the global economy and the domestic economy move within 24 hours. And we're tracking the number of shipments through the economy on a near real-time basis. So we get a first-hand account of actually what is moving and what's not moving. And the advantage is that you're not getting these distortions in inflation that shows up, or same-store sales, or credit card data, which doesn't actually have a perspective on the volume of goods moving. So we actually get to see it. To put this in perspective, and I'll talk about the U.S. domestic market, because I think it's what most people in this room is probably more concerned about, is year-over-year trucking volumes, and trucking is the predominant mode of traffic for moving freight across the United States, are down 17% year-over-year. Now, let me unpack that a bit. Retail volumes, because we look at distribution centers, things that go within 100 miles of a distribution center, tends to be retail goods, big box retailers, and e-commerce, is actually flat year-over-year. There is no degradation in volumes showing up in retail goods, and this is largely why the Federal Reserve is unaware that there's a recession going on in other parts of the economy. It's also why the Wall Street seems unaware that there's actually a pretty significant recession. The long-haul trucking market, which tends to be exposed to the manufacturing sector, auto sector, housing, and energy, is down 30% year-over-year. That is a third deterioration of volume across our economy. And so the question is, how do we get here? I actually think I have an answer for that, is that a lot of our manufacturing base has been moved out of the U.S., been a lot of anger that's empowered Donald Trump to make the case. The problem is, it's not the tariffs itself that's actually causing the problems, because I actually disagree slightly. Retail consumer goods, we're not seeing the kind of inflationary panic that I think was there when you talked about it. But we're seeing businesses basically not just completely go to the sideline. So our board is the largest industrial REIT, Prologis. They had 5 projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, that were teed up in Q1, the first quarter, that those projects have completely gone to the sidelines. Those are projects like the kinds that you guys would be bidding on to move to Chattanooga. Those companies have decided not to actually deploy that capital, and everybody's gone to the sidelines. UPS had just laid off or announced 45,000 layoffs, first major RIF in their history. If you look at the stock prices of FedEx and UPS, any transportation company, you're seeing basically they're trending at like basically 10 years of erosion. We're seeing a lot of major trucking companies at risk for bankruptcy. This is the worst freight market we've seen since the great financial crisis. And it's not just tariffs, it's because the Federal Reserve has been so worried about inflation that they've refused to cut interest rates faster to respond to these developments. And I think Washington, no offense against politicians, I think they're completely unaware of what's happening, because they look at the stock price and the stock market and think everyone is doing great when we're all basically not responding to these developments.
Thank you, Craig, for that. I think, John, I'd like to turn to you next. I mean, you obviously, in your experience, you're advising a wide range of international companies on trade deals, on expansions. What are you hearing from the companies you're working with as their most frequent concerns or challenges regarding tariffs? And how do those vary across sectors like manufacturing or pharmaceuticals or even the tech industry?
You kind of already stole most of my thunder because you already talked about uncertainty and lack of ability to plan. And I think that's been the biggest challenge for most companies, because regardless of the legal basis for the tariff, whether it's IEEPA or 232 or 301, what you're starting to see now is negotiations that are occurring at the White House or at Commerce or some of these other agencies where companies are now working on trying to get different exclusions, exemptions. You look at IEEPA, the rates go up, the rates go down, this country, that country, this exclusion, steel and aluminum, well, not just steel and aluminum, now it's derivatives, and those products are getting added every single week. And so if you're a business and you're trying to plan for the long term, maybe you're importing components, raw materials, how do you do it in a way that makes economic sense? Because I don't know today if I'm going to be paying a 5% tariff, a 50% tariff. This country, should I move my supply chain from, Southeast Asia? Should I do it? You just don't know. And so as a result, what we're seeing is now just nothing, literally, it's just sitting. And the money is sitting, the people are sitting, they're laying off people because, they have to cut production. So it's that really, I could get into the weeds on some of these things, that, this guy's calling about this or that, but really, this is the challenge, and until we find some stability, whatever that is, okay, if it's gonna be 15%, it's gonna be this, it's that, all of you in business can then begin to plan. And you can go get financing, you can raise money, you can go and start getting into these long-term contracts again. But until that time, I think we're gonna see more and more of this. And it's really gonna hurt. I think it goes into some of the things that all of you were saying, especially Craig, about just this, you can't really do anything. I was out giving a speech in California, and one of the focus areas was agriculture. And I was talking to the farmers out there, and we quickly got off of, well, my pistachios, I can't sell them in Canada, or I can't sell them in China. I can't work on my water conservation, my irrigation, because I don't have the money. And of course, California is what? It's in the grips of, water issues. And so it's really starting to impact not just today, tomorrow, but like long-term. Like really long-term stuff. If they can't get a handle and start working on some of these waters. We're blessed here. I think the rain has moved, here, which is great. I know, like, from an economic development perspective, it's like, you don't want to go to California, you want to come here with water. But I think it's those kinds of issues. I had another company call me. All their production happens in China. Every single piece that they make is Chinese. They figured out a way to make their product, bring it to the United States, and they can sell it for 25%, 30% less. And they were just starting to get market share. They're getting a lot of traction. And now, we had anything from 170% tariffs down to, what are we at now? I think maybe 34%. But it totally messed up the math. And so they've spent all this time, all this money, and now their whole company is likely going to go under because they can't figure out a solution. We're working on them right now by going piece by piece of their products and seeing if it's cheaper to import all the pieces and then establish an assembly facility. But that takes tons of money, to do it. So those are the kinds of things, but I think it all really stems on that uncertainty.
And I think in addition, not only does it take tons of money to do that, but it also takes time.
Yeah, I think a one and done would have been fine. I think even if Trump had said 50% forever, everyone would have been fine.
Yeah.
I know how to budget that, but I think the fact that there is so much, the best example of this I can give locally is that there's a Section 232 tariff that was just put on heavy-duty trucks. And if you know anything about Chattanooga's economy, you know how important trucking is. Put this in perspective. So Knight Swift bought US Express last year. They buy 8,000 trucks a year, and they just continue to come in every year on a standing order. That tariff will raise the price of those trucks by $50,000. Now, these orders were made 3 years ago, 2 years ago, made years ago. And that tariff goes into effect, or went into effect November 1st. Now, that will cost them $400 million. To put it in perspective, Covenant does the same thing. They order at least 1,000 trucks a year. You're talking a 50,000 truck impact. That's $50 million. Now, the reality is we don't produce the kinds of heavy-duty trucks in the United States. We had thought that USMCA, which is the trade agreement with Mexico, would be exempt, and that's not the case. And so it's the uncertainty is the problem. I don't think the tariffs are the issue. I think it's the actual whiplash that's taking place, and what we're seeing, the softness is in the industrial sector, not in the consumer sector. It's the industrial sector, and the data supports this, the industrial sector. The one that Donald Trump promised he was going to fix is exactly where you see the softness, not in the consumer side, it's in the industrial sector.
Now, just real quick, so another example would be the pharmaceuticals, so life science, bioscience. You know, the 232 investigation is done. We all expected an announcement on tariffs back in August, and now we're in the first week of November. Everything I'm hearing is we haven't received it because of all of the negotiation that's going on right now about individual companies that are lobbying the White House and others to either exclude their products, their APIs, or maybe it's even gotten to this point, you know, if you and I are competitors, I'm trying to get the White House to hit you and leave me out. And so you're starting to get all this crony capitalism type stuff that's going on. And so that's really, that's also becoming a big deal, is these negotiations. You know, I'm Italian, I grew up in Boston, so, you know, it's all about kiss the ring in where I grew up. And that's kind of what you have now. It's like you go see the Godfather, you talk to the Godfather about your problem, and, you know, you get something done. But that's really, and I'm joking a little bit, but that's really how I grew up. But that really is something you're starting to see. And then that, from an economist perspective, distorts markets. It really just messes up these things. Again, not for a week, not for 2 weeks, but like long term, it's really hard to get yourself out of it.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry,
Mary
Nick,
Kelly,
I
I
want
want
to cut you off.
Go ahead, Mary Kelly, but then Claudia, I actually want to come to you back on that point as well.
Well, and this may be a good segue, because it's Dr. Kramer I really want to hear from, with respect to saying, you know, it would be okay if the tariffs were set. It would be okay from the standpoint of long-term investment. But the thing we haven't talked about is inflation. There's no way that, I mean, again, I'm not the economist, but how could that not be inflation? I mean, again, that we've seen inflation numbers tick back up just a little bit, and that's essentially all they were starting to get under control, obviously. But I mean, you know, the numbers that we're struggling with just to run a city budget, which informed our last property tax debate, are, you know, we're 25% over the last 4 years. And so just when we're starting to get under control, you know, those costs, if they're going to have to pay another $40 million for the trucks, they're going to have to be passed on to the consumer at some point.
And I think that was going to be one of the points that we really want to discuss is, you know, ultimately, who is paying the cost of the tariff at the end of the day? You know, you have administration that said this is really the tax on the foreign countries, but it's really the tax on the businesses producing the goods. Can you kind of talk about that, Claudia, about kind of who's paying that tax? But then I'd also love for you to talk about, you know, we often heard about these tariffs, these are going to bring jobs back, but the results have been kind of mixed on that. Can you talk a little bit about really the consensus from economic studies, how this is impacting jobs overall?
So I think a good way of thinking about it, and this is the way I try to tell my students, is it's what we call the seen versus the unseen. And so you can see the steel workers. It's in the headlines, it's in the news. 1,000 jobs are saved. But what you don't see, the unseen, are the downstream effects. And so any product that uses steel is now more expensive. And so specific to the 2018 steel tariffs, 1,000 jobs were saved in the steel industry. That's the end of the story. But the economists keep digging. Well, it turns out 75,000 jobs were lost in the downstream industries. I don't really call that a win, but that's the trade-off there. And that's just one example of one tariff. And that is going to ripple through when you have it on as many products and services as you're seeing currently. And the other side of that, though, so that's just so going back to the steel example, steel and the downstream industries. But the other thing that you have to remember is that imports equals exports, which means that if we are importing less, we export less. So anybody that is in the exporting industry, which I'm sure John, again, can come back and speak to, as he was mentioning, with the pistachio farmers can't sell their pistachios. That means that those jobs are also being negatively affected or gone. Wages on average, with the increase in tariffs, are 5% lower. The projected GDP loss is 6% per year if we keep the tariffs that is currently being touted. So that's the long-term effects. That's massive changes in our life expectancy, massive changes in our lifestyles. And a lot of that, again, it can sound theoretical in some sense when we say, well, it's because of the inefficiencies, but that's exactly what's happening. I do agree with Craig that if I had a choice between one rate and that was it, I would take that over the uncertainty and the policy switching and the back and forth and what we're living in. However, it is incredibly costly to live in a pro-tariff world. So anything outside of free trade imposes cost, and imposes significant cost, and oftentimes they're hidden. And that's where, so back to Adam's question about employment effects, it's because the headlines give you what you can visibly see. The reshoring as one of the common phrases right now. Look, these jobs are coming back. Well, what jobs are being lost? That's not being written about. But the economists in our journal articles that nobody reads, we talk about them and we say there are more jobs lost. And the steel example, 100 times more than what you're supposedly saving. And the way that we explain that is because of the massive inefficiencies. It creates resources going to where we actually aren't that good at producing them. Now, we do a lot of great things in this country. That's what we need to be specializing in. We don't need to be saving jobs in areas that actually we're not that great at making that product. That's great. That's called creative destruction. So some businesses are formed and some go out of business if we're not that good at doing that anymore. That's capitalism, not the crony capitalism that John was talking about when hissing the ring, which I think that's an excellent analogy, unfortunately.
I have a slightly different take. I was pro-tariff. I'm just going to say it bluntly. And the reason I was pro-tariff is it's a national security issue. We have our entire supply chain. If we get into a conflict with China, and if you haven't studied history, you'll know that supply chains win wars. That's why one of the reasons that we've seen military conflicts end up, you can go look at the American South. The reason the American South got overran, frankly, by the North was largely because the North had all those supply chains. We didn't have that in the South. We don't have a choice but to move some of it, regardless of the cost of doing so. There's a geopolitical national security issue that's at bay. And going into this year, going from November, we talked to a lot of the global supply chain manufacturers. There was so much enthusiasm over Trump's policies coming into this year. That all changed when he decided to make Canada the 51st state and started talking about USMCA changing it, because people are like, wait a second, we were signed up to move our supply chain from China. We were all on board that. Companies felt like that was the right thing to do. They were willing to pay the additional cost to do that, but they wanted a long-term plan. It was when the first set of tariffs that we got were actually on Colombia. There was that weird weekend where we couldn't land deportees in Colombia that he decided to add that. But it was the actual Canada and Mexico. We can see in our data. The freight data deteriorated on Valentine's Day. If you go back and look at when the destruction of the goods economy happened in the United States, it was Valentine's Day this year is when everything went awry. And it was all related to the USMCA because people woke up and said, this is not what we signed up for. And that's the problem. I think most businesses we talk to, because we started talking to supply chain professionals of some of the largest supply chains last summer, they were all prepared. They moved a lot of product in preparation of the Donald Trump victory. It was very clear that Joe Biden was not going to be the winner. And they started preparing. And they were all super enthusiastic about taking their supply chains from China. But when it went awry is when it wasn't a story about national security, and it was a story about we don't know what is actually clear.
Well, if I could push back a little bit on that. So my clients were willing to move. I do a lot of work in China, have since the late 90s. So I represent Chinese companies, I represent US companies. They were fine to move. In fact, I was moving a lot of Chinese companies to Mexico. But the tariffs, no one was on board for that, at least none of my clients. They were looking at it more from the perspective of, if you look at Adam as an economic developer, he's not attracting companies by tariffing people. He's attracting companies by offering incentives, different types of incentives, whether it's tax credits, discretionary funds, workforce training. There's a lot of things you could have done that I believe would have accomplished the same thing instead of taxing people. You know, it's a carrot and a stick. And maybe you have to tariff some of it. I'm not going to say it's just all or nothing, but I think there are so many other ways that we could have gone about, especially on true national security issues like pharmaceuticals, life science, that kind of stuff, maybe even steel and aluminum. You know, there's ways you can do it. This approach is, I mean, no offense, but you know, the case that's going to be argued on Wednesday, these people make like learning toys. That last I checked, not really a national security issue, or even some other folks here that I know that make some of their products. These are not national security things. This is Donald Trump's view, and it has been since the 80s. He's living in a world that doesn't exist anymore. We live in such a globally interconnected economy. If I wanted to buy something from anyone in this room, I had to know you. Or you had to send a salesman, or you had to send me a catalog in the mail. Now, I want something, right here. I can type in whatever I want, and I'll get 7,000, 10,000, whatever, options to buy from literally all over the world. And we just live in a different place. And I think we could have done a better job with with incentives, which we were doing with the CHIPS Act, which we were doing with the infrastructure bill, which we were doing with some of these recent, and by the way, I'm not a liberal or anything. I mean, my father, he's passed away, but he would kill me if I said anything that wasn't, you know, conservative. It just makes good business sense, okay? I mean, it just does, and I think there's so many things we could have done, and we were doing, and we were successfully doing. In tariffs, I just don't see how that does any of it.
Just to clarify, they weren't necessarily excited about it, but they knew it was inevitable.
No, but moving the supply chains, I totally agree, and using, so also my dad was big in NAFTA, he was on Clinton's council for all that, so I'm a free trader, so, you know, I'll tell you that right off the bat. I believe in free trade. And so they were fine to move, because I think COVID taught them lessons about, instead of having extended supply chains, they needed to have more regional supply chains. So if I'm selling in the Americas, I need to be in the Americas. I'm selling in Europe, Africa, I need to be there. I'm selling in Asia, I need to be there. Our auto manufacturers taught us that. I mean, we don't ship a bunch of F-150s to Japan from here. First of all, you can't fit them on the streets, right? And you know, gas is too expensive. So I mean, you know, but we make cars we sell in Japan in Asia. And guess where all that money comes back to? It comes back to Ford or Stellantis or any of these others that are here. So, I mean, there's, again, ways we could do these things. I think that in tariffs, to me, again, you know, I'm anti-tariff now. I said I wasn't going to do this today. But I don't feel like they've been good for our economy. I've had multiple foreign direct investment projects canceled because of tariffs. The math no longer made sense. And so they canceled. And you know, it's probably all told between the three of these projects, over 1,000 jobs. I mean, so that's pretty good.
Thanks, John. And if I can just jump in again, I guess I'm up here to represent the political perspective, although, again, I'm a rookie politician, and I do live in Chattanooga. I'm not in D.C. very often, thank God. But Senator Gardenhire's here from the state, and again, it's not lost on any of us in the state of Tennessee that we are extremely sensitive to the economy, because we're a sales tax driven state. And look, we're number 3 or 4 in the country for foreign direct investment. So this is not a game. The stakes are very, very real. I'll also say it's not actually very political. I mean, we in this country were always going to do some form of industrial policy. Back what Biden was doing was very much a different form of industrial policy, but I think we got our tired of getting our butts kicked by a lot of these Asian economies that had a much more focused approach to it, whether that was, you know, the Chinese or even Koreans. But the question is what works and what doesn't work at the end of the day, I guess.
Well, Folks, what I will say is, we've had a list of questions prepared, and they've actually been going through them without me even having to ask the questions. But I would like to ask Mayor Kelly, looking ahead then for Chattanooga, thinking about what specific maybe policy recommendations or partnerships the city can pursue, how can we position Chattanooga as a more resilient hub for domestic production, especially in all of this time of uncertainty?
Well, it's tough, right? I mean, again, I'm very much a localist, and we talk a lot about, Dr. Lobo's working on some circular economy projects for me, but, again, being a city in the state of Tennessee, we've got two sources of revenue to run the city, sales tax and property tax, that's it. Inflation, if these, I know, from a pure economic standpoint, some tariffs aren't necessarily inflationary, but I'll be damned if I can figure out how they would be. Maybe Dr. Kramer can shed some light on that, but to the extent that we can insulate ourselves from that, the better off we're going to be. However, being a manufacturing hub of Volkswagen and so on, that's going to be very, very difficult, right? I mean, again, we can try to pivot. Again, we do have a very, very attractive state. We've got a lot of capital moving in here from other parts of the country. Look, there's a reason that the Economic Community Development Department of Nashville has the office that looks over everybody else's office. It's a very, we in Tennessee worship the altar of good economic policy. So, hopefully, as the dust settles, we'll figure out a way forward that works for us.
And I will say, I think even in light of all the uncertainty, we are still seeing opportunities. And kind of, Mayor Kelly, to your point, it's also giving us a chance to look at how do we pivot, looking at things not only from a manufacturing industrial standpoint, but also from a knowledge economy job standpoint, looking at things like the finance and insurance sector, sectors that may not be as impacted by the distribution of goods and importing and exporting.
Yeah, if I may, you just pitched me the softball, so I'll take it. Again, we are, as you well know, running out of, this is not, Des Moines, Iowa. You don't have giant, acreage of flat cornfield to go out there and develop for light industrial anyway. So we were always going to need to pivot to the knowledge economy for any number of reasons, and perhaps this just forces us to do it a little faster.
So Craig, I want to end with you, and then we're going to have time for some questions and answers, because we're right at about there. But between, the costs, the uncertainty, how are freight forwarders and 3PLs, particularly maybe Chattanooga's ecosystem, adjusting things like contract terms, looking at inventory buffers, or even the carrier relationships to really manage through this process?
There's going to be a lot of layoffs in the freight brokerage industry. It is, this is the worst possible climate for freight brokers, period. Actually, this is an entirely different issue, immigration related. One of the byproducts of what we've had in the last, say, 5-7 years is that the trucking industry has had this view of a perpetual driver shortage, which never existed. And they've influenced Congress to basically pass these laws that has made it easier for people to get into the trucking industry. And the problem is that using regulatory capture by the big motor carriers ended up basically eliminating all the barriers to entry, which means we've had a flood. And immigrants have come over, and I won't even get into the conversation about whether that was good or bad from a policy standpoint, but these are jobs that are very easy to go get. And by eliminating the barriers to entry, we've had this collapse. And so we have a volume collapse in the freight side, and then we have this scenario where the administration is now attacking a lot of the policies that they view as sort of dangerous related to safety and immigration. And that's actually causing a lot of motor carriers to leave the industry that we're operating there. So that's going to heat up spot rates. So it's going to compress margins. And that's the worst possible scenario for freight companies. You're going to see layoffs throughout the industry. It is probably one of the worst freight climates that we've seen, and like I said, since the Great Financial Crisis. So not good.
And this is totally unrelated, or related a little bit, but unrelated. One thing I think you should talk about is the use of foreign trade zones and bonded warehouses. I bet you there's not a bonded warehouse available anywhere near here. But I know the chamber, right, operates the foreign trade zone here. And, it used to be foreign trade zones, nobody cared because tariffs were so low that the administrative burden to just to deal with it didn't make a whole lot of economic sense. But foreign trade zones can be a really good strategy for companies, especially for companies that want to import. We talked about strategy, right? Long-term strategy. They're really good if you can, bring in a significant amount of, say, your inventory, raw materials. The foreign trade zones allow you to manipulate those goods and do things to them, so you can then change, sometimes country of origin, you can change the tariff code, and so you can, and when I say manipulate, I don't mean like illegally or improper, but you can alter the
You can
tariff.
manufacture them into something else.
Yeah, and so, which then can may potentially reduce your tariff burden, but the other benefit of it is it allows you to, as you only draw them out of the foreign trade zone into U.S. commerce, then you're paying the duties, okay? And so you can, so that's, it doesn't work right now for Section 301 tariffs. They've exempted all the China tariffs from the foreign trade zone, so you can just defer the tariff. So in the sense of, you can bring a bunch of stuff in from China, and as you use it, you can then pay the duties, which helps with cash flow. But that may be a program, I know the chamber may want to, we're doing a lot more in the, say, Nashville area around that. So if you're a big company, you can ask the chamber to maybe help you apply for like a subzone for just your company. I think Volkswagen has.
So Volkswagen is
Yeah.
probably our largest
Yeah.
zone user, but on top of that, so we, at the chamber, we do host also a Chattanooga Regional Manufacturers Association that we do in partnership, and we actually just held an entire presentation on foreign trade zone benefits where we brought in some of our consultants to talk about the benefits of that. So if anyone here would like information on that, we're happy to share that because I believe we also recorded that. But that is something that we are out there actively talking about with our companies. Really have been on a blitz with a lot of our industrial companies right now, making sure they know about the foreign trade zone program and the potential benefits there. But it is, you have to remanufacture things. There are some constraints and constrictions to that. And to your point that, a lot of companies weren't necessarily using it when the tariff environment is low, but we have seen an uptick in inquiries about it to see if that could be a potential way to help kind of deal with a lot of the uncertainty and a lot of this tariff issue right now. So thank you all so much. I do promise we will end on some optimistic notes as well. I know it's been a little bit of a hard conversation, but I would like to go to questions and answers right now too.
All right, so looking at some of the questions you guys have sent in, there are a couple that are somewhat similar, so I'm going to combine them. One was directly for Dr. Kramer. But I'm going to combine them together. So is there a good free market argument for industrial policy? And kind of combine that with, in your view, what is the upside to tariffs? And that can be open to all panelists, but one of the questions was starting with Dr. Kramer.
There's no free market argument for industrial policy. So free markets means you compete. That's it. There's no subsidies. There's no extra tax breaks. There's no extra tax incentives. You compete. And if you are good at what you're producing, then the market will reward you for that. So it is a pure profit and loss system. Moving to the other part of the question, which was...
What is the upside of tariffs?
I actually can give a position that I don't necessarily take, but that during this recent bout, when we knew the tariffs were going to come, but we didn't know exactly how and what they were, some economists were arguing that if we put on the table all of our taxes, so it's the federal government, they implement a variety of different taxes. And so if we put tariffs as an option, then that could be a better source of tax revenue than, say, income tax or corporate taxes. So if we could kind of rewrite the entire tax code, and we shifted more to rely to increase tax revenue through tariffs, but what we did is we cut income tax and corporate tax rates, that overall that could be better off. It would actually be less distortionary. So there's some debate about whether or not that would be true, but that is the best case argument for why you would use tariffs, is strictly because we have government. Government needs to be funded. How's it going to be funded? We raise taxes. How is taxes going to be collected? Sales tax, property tax, income tax, corporate taxes, and tariffs. And so if you can then put on the table some sort of package that would reduce overall inefficiencies, that would then rely a little bit more on tariffs. So basically you're substituting away from what we're currently doing and moving toward that. But that was kind of the best case, I think, and best argument, but it still is on shaky grounds, I would argue. And Mayor Kelly teed me up twice on the inflation point, so now I'm going to take now I have the mic. Okay. So, inflation is only a monetary phenomenon. What does that mean? Inflation, and the way that we talk about it, is caused by the Fed. So, the Fed, we say, still printing money. The Fed doesn't print money anymore. Magically, money appears. So, that's what causes inflation. What happens with tariffs is it does increase the price, but it's a one-time effect. So, let's say that the tariff rate moves on the learning toys is 20%. So, you're going to see the toys price, instead of being $10, it's now $12. So that's going to be a one-time, that toy now sells for $12. With inflation, it's 2% this year, 3% next year. It compounds every single year. So inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, but tariffs do increase prices. That's the distinction.
Yeah, I mean, one important sort of double down on that is that they increase prices of the declared value. So it's a tax that's effectively assessed when the product's clear, not when they're sold at retail. So if you have a 50% tariff, you're not paying a 50% increase. It's paid on the declared value, and you were saying a lot of people cheat on that, which they do, in terms of what the value is. But I want to talk a little bit about industrial policy and tariffs. Like, we have a national security problem. We don't produce anything here. You talked about the APIs. That is a much bigger problem, that if we ended up in a military conflict, we have a national security problem. If you understood the level and depths of the lack of production here in the United States, like, I am naturally a free market capitalist. The problem is we're dealing with an adversary who has a 50-year plan to rival the United States, and we are unprepared. We cannot fight. The U.S. military imports a lot of the products that we use in our own weapons. That is the issue, and I think that's the tax that, when we talk to businesses, they understand that they need to pay that tax. They don't love it, they don't want it, but the problem is our system is focused on short-term earnings. That's what the capitalism system is. These CEOs have gone out and to benefit their short-term quarterly earnings, they found cheaper supplies. That's why the tariffs actually can force businesses to think differently about where they do production, because it does show up in the price of their wholesale goods. That is why I think tariffs, if they were certain and consistent, actually can achieve the goal of moving production away from China, because if we don't do that and we end up in a military conflict, we stand no chance to win. And that is the problem. You're dealing with an adversary with effectively unlimited resources, has a 50-year plan, and they have been planning this for many, many years, and they're going to use the supply chains as the choke point. As we've already seen, just in the past couple of weeks, they've used rare earth materials to shut down, effectively to threaten our industrial base, which I think is a problem. And I think that's the reason that I'm pro-tariff, because I think if we don't have a tax on Chinese goods into the United States, that there is zero incentive for businesses to think differently about where they move the supply chain, because it's going to impact their earnings if they don't.
Yeah, but say on the rare earths, okay? I mean, we've got them here. The problem is you got to process them, and I guarantee you, none of you, not a single person in this room would say, "Yo, we have to do that in Chattanooga," because then our water supply gets all nasty. I mean, it's horrible. So I think you're exactly right on the national security issues. I think you and I come at it from a different perspective, in that I would rather do deals with my friends. So I'm just, in full disclosure, I'm the British Honorary Consul. I represent the British government. I'm not here today talking on behalf of the British government. So anything I say is not from them. But why can't we do, so for example, Chile, or some of these other places, Australia, very good friends of ours. We should be doing deals and working on things like that. So, as I say, the friendshore, right? That's and that's where I think we're, for whatever reason, this administration doesn't believe in that. And so I think that's where I push back on the tariffs, because I think the long-term effects are they're more harmful than, say, working with the Brits, who have been our best friends for, I don't know, a couple hundred years. We had that little dust up. But I think they're our friends. Canada are our friends. And, there are a lot of these countries that would love to work with us. And I think we can produce those things in a way that makes sense. And again, it goes to your point about we can't make everything. And I'm not saying that's not what you're saying, to make everything. You're saying saying these key things.
I think we should make the Chinese goods more expensive and do exactly what you said, is do deals like the environmental stuff on rare earths. It was horrific, but there are places in the world that are willing, Mexico included,
Yep.
Australia, that you can actually refine those goods. But you have to drive the cost up on China to effectively, because businesses are national rational actors. If I am running a company, no matter how patriotic I am, and a price in China is 20% or 50% less than it is somewhere else, I'm still going to source my goods until there's a conflict.
But but you're never going to win that battle with China, and so what you have to start thinking about. Trump was exactly right. I think a lot of people have been right. It's subsidies, it's currency manipulation, it's theft to buy PR, it's all of that stuff, right? And so tariffs don't address any of those things. And so that's again where I say to myself, just raising the price of China is not goods in China isn't going to change China. And so we've got to be focused more on these other issues because again, I agree with you that China can be a problem. I just don't see how tariffs solve that problem.
I mean, we saw a massive.
Guys, I'm sorry. I've got a whole list of questions, and I am going to move on. I'm so sorry. I hate when they're having such a good conversation. I hate to stop them, but if I don't ask more than one question, I may get attacked when I leave here tonight. So let me ask you this. We're going to switch a little bit to the upcoming Supreme Court conversation. What are our thoughts? This is to open to any of the panelists. Thoughts about what may happen. This may be a little more for John. Briefly. What do you think will happen? What will be the impact depending on how the Supreme Court may judge?
It's really interesting. So this is not necessarily the only outcomes are tariffs are lawful or tariffs are unlawful. That is not the only outcome. The other outcome could be that the Supreme Court comes in and says, well, what is a national emergency? And then they send it back to the lower court to make some of these other determinations. Then you have this idea of it's lawful or it's unlawful. I think if you read the statute from what I've read, the briefs and some other things, you look at the statute and you read it and you interpret it normally. I don't see how you can read it to allow tariffs. Because there's a constitutional prohibition on tariffing exports, and so regulating trade cannot mean tariffs because I think then it would violate the other prohibitions on you can't tariff exports. So, but again, we've seen the court kind of do some mental gymnastics, so it's very possible they could narrowly find a way. I guess I think it's less. I don't know. I'd say maybe it's 60-40. I think they'll find them unlawful, but that doesn't get us out of tariffs. I mean, because what then happens is the White House already has plans to use other tariff provisions, so more 301 investigations, more 232 investigations, and then of course, so you'll see tariffs come that way. There's another provision, section 122 of, I can't remember which trade act, I'm sorry, but it allows for, I think 15% tariffs for 150 days, but that is to usually deal with the balance in trade issues. I don't know if the United States wants to declare an emergency on balance of trade payments and things, because that kind of would spook the markets, I think, but you'll see more tariffs. Now, if they're deemed unlawful, then the importers of record are entitled to refunds. The question will be how difficult is the government going to make that process? So I would suggest if you have paid a lot of tariffs, keep your records, file extensions. The government has 1 year to liquidate, meaning to determine the final amount of tariffs. So ask for an extension. If they won't give you the extension, protest that and get ready to file a lawsuit if they won't do that either. I think, but you'll need your records, you'll need your documents. So whoever's doing this for you, whether it's internal or your logistics providers, make sure they have those documents because you're going to need them. And then I think the other issue is what happens to all of us consumers. So Walmart has stated publicly they've raised prices because of tariffs. So if they're getting a refund, what about us? I don't know if Walmart's going to send me a gift card for whatever I paid down an increased price. But so I think you'll see lawsuits there too.
And that kind of, we were saying Walmart should maybe lower all the prices back for us, but this kind of goes with that idea that if the tariffs are lifted either by a court order or they're just changed or dramatically lessened, what kind of changes could we expect? Would we expect to see prices shift back to where we saw them maybe 9 months ago? What are our thoughts? And this is open to anyone on the panel.
No, I don't think so. I don't think businesses, unless there's a deterioration in demand, are going to refund, are going to lower prices unless they have to fight for customers. Now, maybe when you look at the industrial sector, which has been most hit by these tariffs, that's when I think you'll start to see a little bit more. But everyone is anticipating 232 and these other tariffs. The Trump administration's not done. I just want to make one last point. The Biden administration had tariffs. Trump put tariffs in the first round. The Biden administration did not reverse the tariffs. In fact, they implemented new tariffs. This is not just a Donald Trump thing. It has been around regardless of the administration. It was inevitable that it was going to head this way.
Well, and I think that's the point, is that tariffs are sticky. And the 232s especially. And so, I think there are political reasons for it, plus I think Congress likes the money, and so they're not going to be really that excited to give it up. But again, it goes back to, Craig, what you said earlier about, I say a single rate, but at least whatever the rate is, it is. And you don't have all this fluctuation, or I got mad at a commercial, so I'm going to add another 10%, whatever. And I think, by the way, that goes, I think, to why the tariffs, especially under IEEPA, which is all about national emergencies affecting trade, is really getting upset about a commercial. A national emergency is a persistent trade deficit over 60 years, 70 years. Is that a national emergency? So, that goes back to this other about maybe why I think, and then you get into the weeds of legal arguments about, the major question, all that stuff, but which gets into constitutional stuff.
Okay, so this will be our last question, as we want to try to wrap up about 6:30. And this is open to any of the panelists, but it may be more of a Dr. Kramer question. But it's open to anyone. Why are the tariff effects not showing up? When we look at like a consumer price index, we're not seeing a ton of movement yet. Do we have any idea why that is?
So some of it can be that stores like Walmart and other companies, retail outlets, they would have their inventories, and so it maybe hasn't hit the supply side yet as much. I think as Craig is indicating, it's coming and it's going to get worse, and so that is part of it. The other part is we can change our behavior in subtle ways, and so we maybe alter our demand, I would say, at the margin in terms of our consumption patterns. And so I think some of this we'll see as we get further away from having tariffs, as people start to reduce consumption, figure out in terms of, like household budgeting, what they can not purchase in order to make up for the lost jobs, decrease in wages, and then the overall increases in prices. I think that's part of it. I think some of it is just, the worst is yet to come.
Well, I don't want to end on that.
No,
Okay, just kidding. Maybe it's not the last question.
But if I could add, tariffs.
Please add something positive.
There are lots of opportunities out there, okay? So, yes, tariffs stink. You gotta pay more here and there. There's a lot of strategies I think companies can explore that, when people ask me what do I think, I'm like, you don't really care what I think. I analogize this, and I think this when we talk, I analogize like if I put the game of Monopoly in front of the four of us, and I didn't explain the rules to the three of you, and you were gonna try to play the game, you're probably not gonna win. So I take the tariff and trade policy, and I talk to businesses about, hey, these are the rules of the game, okay? Now, you understand the rules, let's talk about developing a strategy that for your business that allows you to take advantage of those rules and then be successful, at least give you the best chance of being successful. And you'll have to be willing to evolve, you'll have to be willing to adapt as these things change. But there are opportunities out there for companies that are willing to sit down, kind of roll their sleeves up and really think through how they can do their business, and what maybe through exporting, through other ways of doing business.
Well, and I think that's a great point, and that was kind of what I was going to end on is, while we are in this time of uncertainty, while we are still trying to navigate these tariffs and really understand what the impacts are, not only in the present time, but also the long-term impacts are, know that there are resources out there. There are people, there's a community that you can connect with. I mean, it's part of why the IBC is hosting an event like this, is to put us in the room with experts who can help us in navigating a lot of this uncertainty. So I know, John, you had mentioned like the FTZ program. If any of your businesses are interested in learning more about the FTZ program and how you might be able to benefit from that, please reach out to us at the Chamber. We are happy to have those conversations with you. We are also happy to consult with you and advise with you during this time on how companies are kind of continuing to still look at where we can grow, what we can do. Maybe there are other tools out there to address other issues that can help offset some of this as well.
And talk to your elected officials, mayor, not you, because I know you got busy other things to do. But I'm serious. There are conversations happening every day, all day in Washington right now around these issues of trying to exclude my products, include this, get that exempted, not this country. Talk to your congressmen, talk to our senators. They are, especially Senator Blackburn, she's running for governor. She wants your vote, so this is a good time to talk to her. Anyone that's on like Ways and Means or any of those other committees that focus on trade, let them know, like, hey, this is what it's doing to my business. This is what I need in terms of support and resources, because these, let me tell you, your competitors are doing it. So if you don't have, like, maybe look at your trade associations. If you belong to a trade association, ask them, what are you guys doing? How can you help me? Because again, I'm a small business, but you put a bunch of small businesses together, we become a big business. And so I would definitely look at that. If you're looking at exports, I'm the vice chair of our Tennessee District Export Council. Happy to direct you to some resources there. I know that federal government right now is, obviously furloughed, but the export assistance offices are also really good resources. In times of maybe domestic issues, looking out is also a really good opportunity to create jobs too. So,
well, thank you again to our panelists this evening.
And before we dismiss for the evening, I wanted to give Dr. Kramer the last word here. And also, I know we have an upcoming event here on campus that she wants to talk about.
Sorry. Okay. So real quick, thank you for coming. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for the Chamber co-hosting. This has been, I think, a lot of fun. At least I thought this was fun. And hopefully you did too. And you would like to come hear another talk hosted by the Probasco Chair, which is Steve Forbes, February